You've heard it your whole life. Renting is throwing money away. Every payment you make disappears into someone else's pocket, building someone else's wealth while you end up with nothing. It's one of the most repeated pieces of money advice in the world, and it's not exactly wrong, but it's hiding something. Because the people who say renting is throwing money away almost never mention how much money gets thrown away buying. Money that vanishes just as completely, just more quietly. By the end of this video, you'll understand the real math nobody explains. Not to convince you to rent and not to convince you to buy it, but so that for the first time, you can actually see the whole board. Let's start with the part everyone gets right because it's true. When you rent, your monthly payment buys you a place to live and nothing else. When the month ends, that money is gone. You don't own a piece of anything. Over years, that adds up to a very large number that leaves you with no asset at the end. That's real. That's the strongest argument for buying. And it deserves respect. But here's the sentence that changes everything. Ownership is not the same as your mortgage payment, and almost every renting is a waste argument quietly assumes it is. So let's open up a buyer's monthly payment and look inside because most people have never actually done this. When you buy with a mortgage, your monthly payment splits into pieces. One piece goes toward the actual loan balance. Like that part genuinely builds your ownership. Good. That's the money that isn't wasted. But sitting right next to it is another piece, the interest. And especially in the early years of a mortgage, this piece is enormous. For a long time, the majority of what you pay each month isn't buying you ownership at all. It's the cost of borrowing the money. It goes to the bank and it's gone, exactly like rent. Let that land. In the early years of a typical mortgage, a huge share of every payment vanishes just as completely as a rent check. You're renting the money instead of renting the apartment. And we're just getting started because interest is only the first hidden cost. There's property tax, a payment you make every year forever that builds you nothing. There's insurance, required and permanent. There's maintenance, and this one is brutal because it's invisible until it isn't. The roof, the heating system, the plumbing. Homes quietly demand thousands per year on average just to not fall apart, and none of that spending builds ownership. It just prevents loss. Then there are the costs people forget entirely. The enormous fees to buy in the first place. The fees to sell later. The money sunk into a place that doesn't move with you when life does. Add all of these together. Interest, taxes, insurance, maintenance, fees, and you get a number. And that number is the buyer's version of throwing money away. Economists actually have a name for it. They call it the cost of ownership that doesn't build equity. It's the rent you pay even when you own. So the honest comparison was never rent versus zero. It was the money a renter loses versus the money an owner loses. Both of them lose money every month. The only real question is which pile is bigger, and that answer changes completely depending on where you live, how long you stay, and what else you could do with the difference. Now here's the piece that almost no one includes, and it's the most important one. When a buyer puts down a large sum to purchase and pays those higher monthly costs, that money is locked up. It's committed. It's sitting inside the walls of the house. A renter, in theory, has that same money free. Not spent, free. And this is where the entire comparison secretly lives or dies. Because if a renter simply spends the difference, then yes, buying almost always wins because at least the buyer was forced to build something. Forced saving is still saving. But if a renter takes the money they didn't sink into a down payment and higher costs and consistently invest it, the math transforms. Now you have two people building wealth in two different ways, one through property, one through investments. And which one comes out ahead is no longer obvious at all. Sometimes the renter wins, genuinely wins, with more wealth and more freedom. The house was never automatically the better investment. It just felt that way because buying forces you to build equity and renting lets you off the hook. And most people, left off the hook, spend the difference instead of investing it. So the real advantage of buying for many people isn't financial superiority, it's psychological. It forces a discipline they wouldn't have on their own. And that's worth being honest about because it's a genuinely good reason. If owning a home is the only way you'll ever consistently build wealth, then for you, buying really might be the right answer. Not because the math wins, but because it protects you from yourself. That's not a weakness. That's just knowing who you are. But it means the question was never really renting versus buying. The real question underneath was, are you the kind of person who will actually invest the difference or not? If the answer is no, buying quietly becomes your savings plan. If the answer is yes, renting can become a completely legitimate wealth strategy. And the throwing money away line turns out to be one of the most expensive myths you were ever told. Now let's turn all of this into something you can actually use instead of a debate you can't resolve. First, stop comparing rent to a mortgage payment. That comparison is rigged. Compare rent to only the money an owner truly loses. The interest, the taxes, the insurance, the maintenance, the fees. That's the real apples to apples. Second, be brutally honest about the difference. If buying costs more per month, what happens to the money you'd save by renting? If it gets spent, buying is probably your better path. If it gets invested every time automatically, renting is back in the race. Third, factor in time. Buying has huge upfront costs that only pay off if you stay long enough to outrun them. Staying a short time and then selling can quietly be the most expensive housing decision of all, no matter how responsible buying feels. And finally, drop the moral weight. Renting isn't irresponsible and buying isn't automatically wise. They're two different financial tools with two different risk profiles. And the right one depends on your numbers, your timeline, and your honest self-knowledge. The people telling you renting is throwing money away usually aren't lying. They just never opened up the other side of the equation. And the other side is full of money quietly disappearing too. It just doesn't come with a monthly reminder that says rent. See the whole board, then decide. If this changed how you think about one of the biggest financial decisions of your life, subscribe to Mind and Money. Because next time, we're breaking down rich habits versus poor habits and the small daily behaviors that quietly decide which one you become.